Shalom Aleichem. Good evening. Wanted to try a little bit of an experiment tonight. We'll see how it works. Just to get an idea of how complicated Rab Nachman's Torah is, lest one fool himself into thinking that we can really understand Rabbi Nachman. So sometimes it pays to read Rabbi Nachman's Torah just to let it, like, I can't explain it. It's just like it goes into the ears and we don't really comprehend it. But somehow it makes an impression. And if we'd go over it 50 million times, maybe we begin to understand. Maybe. Now, this particular Torah, as we call it, Samach Zion 67, B'Tinyana. Tinyana means in the second half of Likutei MoHaran, deals with the relationship between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah. Li'enei Kol Yisrael, which are the last three words of the Torah, and Bereishis Bara Elokim, the first three words. Like, for example, on Simchas Torah, we finish the Chumash and then we begin immediately afterwards with Bereishis. So that's the official kind of structure, or shall we say format, of this particular Torah, of a Sicha that the Rebbe gave. We can actually know when the Rebbe gave it. This is on the 27th of Tishrei in the year 5570, which is the equivalent of 1809. And this is the first Shabbos after Simchas Torah. And that week, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Barditcheva died. So there's a lot of significant, shall we say, hints here in this Torah to the death of Rabbi Levi Yitzchok Barditcheva. There's a whole story behind it. Anyway, maybe we won't get into it now. But Li'enei Kol Yisrael, the last three words in the Torah. Says the Rebbe, Ki yesh ananim dimechasyan al eina. So he's talking about like clouds that cover the eyes, that impair a person's vision. And we have to understand what that vision is. What are the eyes, the significance of the vision on a level of Pnimius HaTorah. Shehem, what are these clouds that cover the eyes? Romi Rabasi v'Romi Ze'irasa. So this is based apparently on the Zohar, that there's the greater Rome and the minor Rome, sort of like two dimensions of Rome. Rome, of course, is the archetypal enemy of the Jewish people. And their culture represents the klipos. And the klipos are these negative kind of clouds that impair one's vision. And it seems like there are two eyes, a right eye and a left eye, and there's the greater Rome and the minor Rome, and they cover both eyes, the right and the left. And we're going to see as we go along that the Einayim represent Chachma, wisdom, the wisdom of the Torah, the true wisdom, the wisdom of the Almighty, the wisdom of Ein Sof, of infinity. And the counter on the negative side that cover the eyes and block our vision of the truth, of wisdom, of Chachma, they are represented by Rome. Okay. Now, it's interesting that I'm not sure why, but my my intuition tells me that this statement that we're learning here is related to the story of Adam v'Chava, because it says there in the pasuk, "Vayifkechu einei shnehem," that God, so to speak, opened the eyes of Adam v'Chava. So we'll again, I don't have any proof that this has any connection, but I'm just throwing it out that maybe we can somehow make a connection. So again, we have these klipos, and these are clouds, and they make it difficult for a person to have that vision of spiritual and eternal wisdom. Now, ultimately, all of Chachma in the Torah of Breslov is geared towards one single goal, and that is knowing God. So the ability to know God is represented by the two eyes, and that's the wisdom that's inherent in the eyes. And the klipos obscure our vision and make it almost impossible to see God, to recognize godliness. Now, recognizing godliness means to find God in everything. That means every object, every creation, every beautiful phenomenon, sunrise, sunset, every experience and every encounter, it's all godliness. It's all part of a divine plan. And it's all a gilui, a revelation of the will of God, the Ratzon of Hashem. And what blocks us, the klipos that cloud our vision, in the case of both the Einayim, are the Rome of greater Rome and the Rome of minor Rome. And this is all based kimuvah, as is brought down in the Zohar. And now we get to see a pasuk in Koheles, and the interpretation of that pasuk based on the Zohar. The pasuk reads, "V'shavu ha'avim achar geshem." Shlomo Melech describes the clouds that return after the rain. Sometimes after the rain, the sun breaks through, and then we see the light. Sometimes after the rain, it's very cloudy, like in many parts of Europe, especially. What is the deeper meaning of this statement of Koheles? I mean, Koheles doesn't have to be a meteorologist to tell us that the clouds form in the sky after the rains. What's the deeper meaning? So the Zohar is going to make a comment, and we're going to sort of embellish that comment based on a Gemara in Shabbos. Ze ma'or einayim. This is the light of the eyes. In other words, when you see something and perceive something through vision, you need light. The more light, the easier it is to perceive. Sheholech achar habechia. So the rains, which of course are the water coming down, are a metaphor for bechia, for crying. Now we're going to have to ask ourselves the following question. Is this bechia positive or the opposite? And if you take a look at the Gemara in Shabbos, which the Rebbe quotes to shed a light on the Zohar interpreting the pasuk in Koheles, we'll have a clear-cut answer to our question. Shal yidei bechi holech umistalek ma'or einayim. The weeping causes the light of the eyes to weaken, and the vision kind of fades away, so that the bechia, the crying, now is another factor that obscures our vision, just like we spoke about the clouds. And now we're seeing that after the geshem, after the bechi, we end up with hananim. Like shavu avim, avim means hananim achar geshem. So we've got the Geshem, which is Bechia, and as a result of Bechia, we're up to a clouded vision. It's interesting how even our language, in the way we express metaphors, express this deeper idea that there's a Bechi that clouds our vision. I use the word clouds deliberately. Now we have to know what the significance of Marav is, right? The sun sets in the west, and that brings darkness. Kibe Mizrach, in the east, Chama Zorachas. The sun rises and gives light. Ube Marav, in the west, Shokas. The sun sets. Nimsa Shemarav Hushkias Ha'or. Marav means the Shkia. Shkia literally means when it goes down. Shakua, descend, it descends. The descending of the light and the descending of the sun in the west. This is a result of Bechi. Again, on a deeper level, Bechi, we said, represents the clouds, right? It brings the clouds, and it obscures our vision, our chachma, our ability to perceive godliness, and that's what's happening in the Marav. The Marav, which Shkias HaChama, is going to generate a situation of clouding our vision. And it's equivalent to Bechi because we said as a result of Bechi, the eyes are full of water and they cloud our vision. Mistalek ma'or einayim. The light of the einayim. Do you remember we discussed before the statement in the Zohar, Ze ma'or einayim. Ma'or einayim is eyesight, the ability to perceive through eyesight. And mistalik ma'or einayim means exact opposite. The light of the eyes, the eyesight, is now clouded. It fades away. So we're talking about the descent and the diminishing of the or. Now the Rebbe says the following. Ki Marav, if you juggle the letters, the 4 letters of Marav around, and each letter is the beginning of a word, what you'll end up with, taking the 3rd letter, which is Reish, and the 1st letter, which is Mem, finally, the 2nd letter, which is Ayin, ending with the 4th letter, which is Beis, Rachel Mevake al Banel, a pasuk in Yirmiyahu and Navi. Rachel weeps for her children. So the weeping of Rachel for her children is now connected to Marav, which is Shkias HaChama. So the Rachel Mevaka, that Bechi, represents clouding the eyesight of wisdom, Ma'or Einayim. The descent of the sun brings the darkness, which is the absence of Chachma. And that's symbolized by the sun setting in Marav, because Marav is Rachel Mevaka al Banel. Now, the Gemara Baba Basra says that Marav represents the Shechina. Shechina b'Marav. So the Rebbe now has a problem, because we're saying that Marav is going to bring the darkness and cloud our vision, but yet it's where the Shechina is located. Gemara Baba Basra, Shechina b'Marav. But the answer, says the Rebbe, is that Ashchina bocha umialeles, even the divine presence is weeping, is moaning, kaviyachol. Again, you can't say about God that God weeps and moans, but what would bring about the weeping of the Shechina that's so close, like a loving mother to Klal Yisrael, is breaking out like Rachel breaks out in crying, in weeping, in moaning for her children? Al Yisrael. God is crying for Israel. Bechinas Rachel mevake el baneh. Rachel is now symbolically a metaphor for Shechina. Rachel is the archetype of the mother that loves and protects her children. And she's crying for her children. She refuses to receive any consolation. She's constantly weeping because her children are gone. Where are they gone from? They're gone from Eretz Yisrael. They've gone into Golus, into the exile. And there they are suffering. They are being tormented by the Goyim. V'hi bocha al tsaras Yisrael. She weeps over the suffering of Klal Yisrael. Hamafuzarim b'Goyim ve'inam el makomam. They're spread amongst the nations and not in their own land. Valkein shchinas oha'or. It's no coincidence that the sun sets in the west. And why is that? Because the west represents Rachel mevaka al bolea, and she's weeping and crying over the darkness of the dispersion of the Jewish nation amongst the nations, over the suffering of the Jewish people. That's the darkness that's Shkias HaChamim. And it's all in the Marav. You know, the Rebbe is now, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. He's giving a spiritual explanation for a biological, for a phenomenon in nature. You know, the sun sets in the west. You know, did you ever ask yourself, why does the sun set in the west? So you'll ask a scientist, you get one answer. But if you want to get an answer from Pnimius HaTorah, then you have to learn this chapter, this Torah. And it's amazing because the Shkia setting in the west is part of the divine creation. We're now getting a little bit of an insight into the way God created the world, with the sun setting in the west. And that's Shkia Sa'or. So now the Rebbe asks a question. Chazal teach us that out of the walls that surrounded the Beis HaMikdash, only one is left. Which wall is that? The western wall, correct? The Kosel HaMaravi. I don't hear you. Maybe you have to unmute yourself. Are you there? I see names. I don't see any faces here. Oh, I see Brian.
Hi, Brian.
Brian looks comfortable.
That's what I'm scared of. You're going to see how comfortable I look. Hey, Rabbi.
It's good to be comfortable. Not too comfortable, because then you might fall asleep. Oh, there's Chaim. Chaim's out there in the field somewhere, harvesting the crop. So the Shechina is crying in the west. And the west represents the diminishing light of Shkias HaCham, of sunset. And that Marav is Rachel Mevaka al Bonea. She's crying, weeping, moaning over the loss of Eretz Yisrael, over the dispersion of her children, the suffering of her children in exile. But we're left with one kosel of the four walls that surrounded the Mikdash. Which one?
Western wall.
Excellent. The western wall, the kosel Hamaravi. Why? But the answer is Shesham Hashchina, the Shechina is Memarav, the Marbavasra, Vibocho Mialeles, crying and moaning al Churban Beis Hamikdash. You see, we visit the Kosel Maravi, but we don't realize that Kosel represents God's crying over the lot of his people, his beloved people, Klal Yisrael. Ki b'marav sham Rachel mevake al banim. Okay. This is what I call Hakafa al. Now we get Hakafa B. At this point, Rabbi Nachman is going to claim that when we spoke before about Ma'or, the light, and we said the light comes from the east, the Ma'or Einayim, we have to talk about two different Ma'oros, two different luminaries. Is that a good word? Luminaries. One is called Ma'ore Or. Those are the good guys. And the other is called Ma'ore Eish, luminaries of fire. Again, basing himself on the Zohar. Vehem zeh le'umazeh. These are one opposite the other. I mean, this is based on a principle that we've seen over and over again from Koheles, that whatever is on the side of Kedusha has the opposite, the antithesis on the side of Tuma, of impurity. So there are two luminaries, two Ma'oros. There's the Ma'ore Naim of Ma'ore Or, and then there's a destructive luminary that's Ma'ore Eish. Shekisheyesh koach leMa'ore Or, if one goes up, the other goes down. So if there's power and strength to the luminaries of light, then the Ma'ore Eish are nichnoim, are subjugated or subdued. If the Ma'ore Eish are intense, if they are, so to speak, winning the battle, then that sets up a process in which the luminaries of light are diminished, subdued, and chas v'shalom even removed. The azai miskabrim ma'ore eish, the ma'ore eish become all powerful. Obviously, the Rebbe here is talking about some terrible, perhaps catastrophe. And in the tradition of Breslov, he was talking about the loss of Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Mibarditch, who the Rebbe considered like his Rebbe. But what catastrophe is the Rebbe explicitly talking about? When the Ma'ore Eish HaMiskabrim, they're powerful, and they subdue the Ma'ore Or, Zeh B'chinas Churban Beis HaMikdash. Now, when we talk about the destruction of the Mikdash, what are we talking about? What element in nature is responsible for the destruction of the Mikdash? Can you help me out?
Not able.
I can't hear you, Alan. What are you saying? Which element? I mean, we're not talking about, smashing the Beis HaMikdash. Nobody came in with a hatchet, a hammer, and broke down the walls of the Mikdash. What did they do to the Mikdash? Alan, you have to unmute yourself, I think.
They burned it.
Excellent. But we're talking about Aish.
They burnt it, yeah.
The Aish of the Churban Abayis represents the strength and the victory, the success of the Ma'orei Aish over the Ma'orei Or. Bechinas, and we see this in the pasuk in Eicha. Of course, Eicha is all about crying over the loss of the Beis Hamikdash. Mimaram shalach eish batzmosai. From on high, he, with the capital H, sent the fire into my bones. We think in our limited perspective that the enemies of the Jews, the Babylonians, later the Romans, they set the Beis HaMikdash to torch. But the pasuk is telling us that really the fire came down from heaven. The Medrash reports that Klal Yisrael came forward to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They said, you sent the fire down to destroy the Mikdash. You'll have to rebuild the Mikdash. The mazik, the damager, has to make good for his damages. He has to compensate. And the Gemara Bava Kama tells us that the future Beis HaMikdash will also come down from Shamayim like an Aish. But this Aish is the Aish of Ma'orei Or. We were responsible for the removal of the Ma'orei Or. We ourselves, through our sins, were responsible for clouding our own vision. We pushed God aside, pushing him far away from us, so that we didn't have that vision of clarity of seeing the Almighty. And once we diminished the Ma'orei Or, the light, nature of was a vacuum, and the Ma'orei Or are replaced by Ma'orei Aish. That represents the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Bechinas Rachel mevakal banea. As we said before, the tears that fill the eyes, swell the eyes, are clouds that make it impossible to have a clear eyesight, a clear vision. Ki abachia hu bechinas histalkus Ma'orei Or. The Ma'orei Or, which we said were the lights of wisdom, were clouded. And that's Rachel mevaka al banea. And once the Ma'orei Or are removed, Azai, I call it nature of was a vacuum, Azai miskabrim chas Ma'orei Eish, b'bchinas mimaram shalach Eish. B'zeh b'chinas ha'alama. Alama means concealment, and its opposite is gilui, revelation, hisgalus. Now we're talking about alama. What was concealed as a result of the Ma'orei Eish and the destruction of the Mikdash? Shenis alem hayofi v'pe'er shel kol ha'olam. The beauty and the glory of the entire world now became concealed. How so? Yesh tzaddik shehu hayofi v'hape'er. Now, when we talk about a tzaddik, that's a hint. Who do we think of? And especially if we add the description of Yofi, the beautiful tzaddik. Anybody know who I have in mind?
Yaakov
Yosef HaTzadik.
Yosef, excellent. Yosef is described as Yefei Tar, Yefei Mar. He has that midah of Rachel, and he represents a handsome, comely, beautiful man. And Huayofi Vape'er, Vachein, the grace of the entire world, Shekolom, Pinas, Vayihi Yosef Yefei Tar V'Yefei Mara, V'chinas Yefei Nof, Misos Kol Haaretz. Now, I'm not sure why the Rebbe quotes that pasuk in Tehillim Memches. Yes, Nof is a vision. Yefei Nof is a beautiful vision, something that appears beautiful and it's a pleasure to look at. Misos Kol Haaretz, the joy of the entire earth. That's the tzaddik. That's Yosef HaTzadik. So this pasuk is describing Yosef as Misos Kol Haaretz, the joy of all the earth. Everyone sees, everyone perceives Yosef. Everyone appreciates the tzaddik, and that's the Ma'orei Or. Ki zeh tzaddik amiti shu b'chinas Yosef hu hahidur hayofi shel kol ha'olam. We're talking about the beauty and the majesty of the entire world. When it's revealed, he became popular or renowned. And he's elevated in the eyes of the world. In a symbolic sense, the eyes of the world are opened. And I suspect that what the Rebbe is trying to convey here is that even in the loss of the Churban Habayis and the Ma'orei Or were replaced by Ma'orei Eish that burnt the Beis HaMikdash, even today, in the post-Mikdash period, we still have a way of getting close to Hashem through the chen of the tzaddik. And that's going to give us back the Ma'orei Or. So even though we lost the Ma'orei Or at the time of the Churban and it was replaced by Ma'orei Eish, we still, even after the Churban, after we lost the Beis HaMikdash, we still have a method of getting that vision, that clarity of Ma'orei Or. And how so? By perceiving the beauty and the splendor or grace of the entire world, which is the tzaddik ha'amiti. So if we get close to the tzaddik, then we're going to have the bechina of Ma'orei Or. He now has a clear vision. He can see. Like the pasuk says, "Vayaminu b'Hashem uveMoshe avdo." Moshe is the true tzaddik, And Klal Yisrael reached that high level in which they believed not only in Hashem, but also in Moshe Avdo. And that gave them projecting them to be closer and closer to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's what we have to do in every generation, especially after the Churban Abayis. We have to get closer and closer to the leaders, the tzaddikim of the generation, the Moshe Rabbeinus of each dar. And now at this point, we get to Roman numeral number 3, the third segment of Torah Samach Zayin. Ha'ikar lehistakel al atzmo. Now, this is a development of Rabbi Nachman in the previous chapter, which is called Siman Samach Vav 66. The subject matter is lehistakel al atzmo. A person has to have a true, genuine, emistika evaluation of himself. Listakel atzma. For good, and maybe for the not so good. Find your essential good. In Breslov, the belief is that even those who reach the lowest level of rishus, a total Rasha, we have to find in the Rasha one Nakuda that's still good, a Nakuda Tova. And when a person is mistakel al atzmo, and he could say, well, I davened today, but I wasn't paying attention, I was distracted, I put on tefillin, I didn't have any kavana, he could start getting down on himself and see his deficiencies. But that's not the ultimate. The ultimate goal is stakel al atzmo, to find the truth in himself, is to project him forward towards greater and greater heights, not to dwell on the past, not to be critical of himself. Yeah, we have cheshbon hanefesh. And there are moments in the day when we should give ourselves a little bit of a rebuke and a musashmuz, and chastise ourselves in an honest way. But those are only fleeting moments. Those are very limited periods of time. The bulk of our day is simcha. And simcha is when we stakel al atzmo be emes, and he finds within himself greatness. But he needs someone to guide him. Who knows every single individual? Is there a human being? I'm not talking about the Almighty right now, who knows every single individual and can guide that individual, uplift that individual, and inspire him. Because very often we cannot look into ourselves. Istachlus al atzmo, we're not capable of doing that. We can't allow ourselves an honest, genuine, real self-evaluation. We need someone to guide us. And that someone has to be able to guide the entire world. Shal yidei shemiskarev l'tzadik amiti shu b'chinas tzadik yisod olam. The tzaddik is the foundation of the world. B'chinas yisod ha'poshut. A simple element. Shemimenu nimshachim kol arba yisodos. And from the tzaddik yisod olam, which is the bechina of yisod, is nimshachim kol arba yisodos. Right? There are 4 basic elements that make up the entire universe. It's Mayim, Eish, Afar, and Ruach. And where do we see in the Torah some sort of an allusion to the four Yisodos? V'nahar yotzei mi Eden lahashkos es hagan. The river issues out of Eden to water the garden. Umisham, and from there, it splits. V'chayil arba rashim, and it becomes four separate major water pathways. Says the Rebbe, Nar Yotze mi Eden, the river that issues out of Eden, Zeh bechinas Tzadik Yisod Olam. This is the tzaddik who represents the foundation of the world. Who bechinas Yisod Pashut. I think he means by Yisod Pashut something that cannot be I think Yisod Pashut represents divinity, endless, infinite space. Asher Misham, Ipared V'Hayul Arba Rosh. From there, it separates into four heads. Shenim Shachim min Atzadik Kanal. So what do we understand here? Not much. He says that the Nor Yotze mi Eden lahashkos hagan u'misham yipared l'chvayil arba roshim, and this is a metaphor for the four Yisodos that are the basic elements in the creation, the foundation of the world. But then he interprets v'Nor Yotze mi Eden Zeh bechinas Tzadik Yisod Olam. How do you understand this? Asher misham yipared v'hayil l'arba rosh. Hainu b'chinas harba yisodos shenim shachim min atzadik v'shem iskarev elav ayitei zeh roilo listakel bi'atzmo al kol amidos echu ochez bahem. So when a person gets close to Hashem, he's able to be self-critical. He can introspect, I think is the word, right?
Introspect.
Introspect. How do you say it in Spanish? probably very similar. Ukshemiskarev elov roilo listakel biatzmo al kol amidos. He should be able to do an introspection on all the various character traits of his personality and be able to evaluate where he stands. Echu oches b'hem. That is the main goal of his karvus l'tzadik, listakel bi'atzmo al kol amidos. Ki kol amidos nimshachim in ha'arba yisodos. Like, for example, the midah of kas, of anger, comes from Eish. Or the midah of humility comes from Mayim. Or perhaps Zizus comes from Mayim. Like we saw by Reuven. Pachas kamayim. Ve'arba yisodos nimshachim en atzad. What does that mean? The four elements derived from the tzad. Al ken, kishnizgala zeh hatzadik, shu achen vayofi shel ha'olam. And we saw before that the tzaddik is the splendor, the beauty, the delight of the entire world. Right, the tzaddik has that grace, and anyone who attaches himself and includes himself through dveikus in the tzaddik is included in the chen ha'emes, that true grace. And what happens as a result? Niftachim einav. The eyes of wisdom are open. He can now look inner to his inner self, evaluate himself. Where's he holding with regard to various character traits? Those that derive from the four elements of the world. So let's go over this last paragraph. You start with Gilui Atzadik, Chen V'Yofi Shel Olam. Anyone who gets close to the tzaddik. Anyone who gets close to the tzaddik, he's encompassed by the grace of the tzaddik, the true, genuine grace, and his eyes are open. And what's the ultimate goal of opening his eyes? So that he can make an introspection and evaluate where he stands with regard to all these character traits. The Gam Yochel Liros Ulistakel B'Gdulas Hashem Ulistakel Ba'olam. Not only are his eyes open to see himself, his true, genuine self, through a process of introspection, but he also, at the same time, can see the greatness of God, divinity, and godliness. If you remember, we discussed at the very beginning of this presentation that's called Ma'orei Nayim, the opposite of which is the greater Rome and the lower Rome, and they try to conceal Elokus, and they try to make a barrier between us and the goal that we're trying to achieve of getting closer and closer to the Ribbonu Shel Olam. So in other words, you have one isgalus that brings another isgalus. The isgalus of the tzaddik, when the tzaddik can be seen, so to speak, I don't mean seen physically, but you can get close to the tzaddik. That's going to bring about the Arba Yesodos, because he, the tzaddik, is responsible for the Arba Yesodos. And that's going to allow him to examine himself, his own midos, and where he's holding. And at the same time, as a result of this Galus HaTzadik, which is the Pe'er, the splendor, he comes to believe, not only believe, but to cling to God. And this is what, of course, is called Dveikus. So let's just see if we can read one more paragraph. Ki kishazeh tzaddik nisgalev and his parsim bolam ze bechina shame. Shame is a reputation. Ta'inu shen his parsim, he becomes a public name. Yesh lo shem ba'olam, and he has like a famous name in the world. U'v'toch zeh Hashem shel tzaddik la'emes. Melubash u'meshutaf shmo yisbar. Ki shmo meshutaf b'shmeinu. Nimtza, shenisgadel shem hatzadik, nisgadel shmo yisbarach. V'chol ma shenisgadel yoser shem hatzadik. Is niskadel yoser shmo yisbarach kaviyachol ki shmo meshutaf b'shmeinu. It's like a partnership, an association between ours and his name. All right, then this is where we'll stop for tonight. Again, we tried to get a certain structure here, and especially understanding the Churban Beis HaMikdash, which we're going to begin to grieve over this Sunday if the Mikdash is not built before Sunday. So let's hope it will be. And then we don't have to go through Eicha and Kinos and Echi in our search for the Almighty.
Thank you and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you very much. Shabbat Shalom.